Good evening. This is a meeting of the Police Oversight Board for Albuquerque. My name is Joanne Fine, and I'm chair. And I welcome you to this meeting. We have a lot to cover, so I would like it if we just get started. We are up to accident data presentation. Mr. Wilhelm, may I start by saying I'm really glad you're here. Lieutenant Sanchez is here. We've worked closely together. Major Tyler is here. There she is. There are a lot of people who have been helpful in this. As you know, we had a report that was less than adequate, Deputy Chief Garcia and Major Tyler brought in the right people to pull together the data that we could use to understand traffic accidents involving police officers. We have been interested in this for some time. Leonard and Dr. Ring both have been the ones pushing this over time and well before there were any accidents that made the newspaper. So it was a concern to us, and we are grateful and happy to hear what the police department, what their yeoman's effort put together. For those of you who may be in the media, there are copies of the full report available for you here so that you can have that. I know you're going to be taking notes fast and furious, but just so you know, you will have a hard copy of the report, and Mr. Wilhelm is going to give us a summary of that report, which is, I think, 30-something pages long. So this is a summary, not the drill down, okay?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to reiterate a couple things, first off, for those of you who don't know me, I am TJ Wilhelm, and I'm the manager of the Real-Time Crime Center. For those of you who don't know what the Real-Time Crime Center is, basically our job is all about getting information in the hands of officers so they can make decisions, and also getting information to them real time as they respond to calls for service so they know what they're heading into. We have a wonderful team of analysts. We have 6 analysts, and including 1 contract analyst, and we have 2 PhDs on our staff that are quite talented. And to reiterate what you said earlier, Deputy Chief Garcia contacted me at the end of June and asked that I task the RTC to conduct an analysis of APD-involved crashes. And we immediately got working on it. And as you said, I've got every slide. I'm going to quickly go through every slide for the sake of time. But certainly, if there are any questions, we're more than available to do so. So the first thing we did was, with this study, what we do with every study is sit down with the customer, if you will. And in this case, the customer who's wanting the analysis is the Police Oversight Board. So I did have the pleasure of sitting down with Ms. Fine and Dr. Garcia, as well as Mr. Harness, to develop a scope of work. And after we sat down, this is what the Police Oversight Board wanted to know. And that was the number of crashes to police-issued vehicles. You want to know the number of sworn officers, number of crashes involving injuries, number of preventable crashes, number of officers involved in multiple crashes, amount paid in liability per year, amount of vehicle damage paid per year, and how Albuquerque compares to other cities. As the analysis went on, we discovered immediately that there was an increase in preventable employee-involved crashes and started looking into other possible causes and included them into the study. So in addition to what the Police Oversight Board requested, we started to look at the number of miles driven by APD. We started to look at calls for service, priority 1 calls for service, all crashes that occurred in the city, and the average years of experience per employee that was involved in the city. And the reason why we did this is because everyone is going to ask, okay, we've seen an increase, but why? And so we worked hard and diligent to try to give you the data for you to make your own determination. And I'll talk a little bit about correlation and why we weren't comfortable making an absolute correlation. But a lot of your opinions are to yourself after you see the data. The data sources that we used, and it's very important that we always state our data sources. We had a compiled list of all claims kept by risk management. We had a compiled list of all findings from the APD Fleet Accident Review Board. We even went as far as getting the recorded miles reported by APD employees when they fill up their gas tanks. They have to enter in their mileage. We collected all that data from the Department of Finance and Administration. We compiled data of all traffic crash reports kept by the APD Traffic Division, and that's any crash involving any citizen in the city of Albuquerque. And the reason why we did that is because it goes to environment. Is there environmental factors that could be at play, such as weather, road conditions, traffic patterns, and what have you? Calls for service data kept by APD Emergency Communications Report. FBI Uniform Crime Report on officer staffing was included. Bid sheets kept by Operations Review. We even went as far as we had to by hand pull the hire dates from the city HR system to find out an average years of experience. And the last thing we did was we sent out questionnaires to hundreds of police agencies in the country that was included in this analysis.
Excuse me just one second. Michelle, could you give us our copies of this? They're in the folder. I'm sorry. My apologies. I'm sorry. Go right ahead, sir. I got you. I'm sorry. My apologies.
No worries, Madam Chair. It's important that with any analysis, we let the people know who are viewing it what our margin of error and disclaimers are. And that's important that I want to point out to you that there are some margin of error here. The 2017 data that you're going to see is a projection using actual data collected for the first months of the year. Simple, first 6 months times 2. We did not do anything to extrapolate month to month to month. We just made it very simple. Medical liability and property damage paid for 2016 and 17, they're very likely to increase as claims get settled, okay? Claims paid are as of July 27th of 2017. That is a floating number. So as the city negotiates, if you were to pull it today, it could very well be different. All crashes and miles driven include all police vehicles. We cannot differentiate between marked, unmarked, and vehicles driven by civilians. And so all the data we're going to present today is all APD employee data. It is not APD officer data. The number of officers fluctuates on a daily basis due to hiring and attrition. So I need to have that disclaimer as well. Now, some crashes provided by the Fleet Accident Review Board did not have a finding, nor did it go through the board process. Some crashes have yet to be heard by the board. Others involve parked vehicles, and it is unclear looking at historical records why there is not a finding listed. We went back and we had to look at paper records to extract some of this data. And at times there was nothing listed. We did include that statistic that counted as a crash, but it's important that you know that there were some that did not have a finding to it, and I want to make sure that that's clear to the board. With any data set, I just basically real quickly give you the data, okay, anytime we do an analysis. Here's the data that we're working with, and this is the data that's going to be supported in the next coming slides that you're going to see. One of the things I do want to note is that with any slide, with addition to the disclaimers and the margins of errors that I've already presented, please also take a note at the notes at the bottom of each slide for any type of data extrapolations or any anomalies that might occur in the data. Comparing ourselves to the change compared to the previous year, we had a 46% increase in APD-involved crashes. We had a 30% increase in all APD preventable crashes. Couple factors that we talked about earlier, everyone in the city of Albuquerque was involved in 13% more crashes, including all citizens. 6% miles driven. And to give you an idea, back in 2012, we were driving 8 million miles. We drove 11 million in 2016. We're seeing a dramatic increase in the miles driven, and I'm going to address that. Property damage paid as of to date for 2016 is 16%. Our total number of officers went down 2%. And I know that's going to be a question. I'm going to address it. We've got fewer officers but more crashes. But believe it or not, there might be a correlation there, and I'll explain that. Officers who participate in the field services bid went down 2%. Priority 1 calls went up 3%, and we're projecting it will continue to go up to 5%. And all dispatch calls, including the 3s, the 2s, and even the 6s and the BOLOs, went down by negative 1%. Here's a quick graph that shows all APD-involved crashes since 2013 and what we're projecting for 2017. And I'm going to quickly go through these, and so I apologize for the sake of time. Preventable APD-involved crashes. That's what it looks like over the 5-year study period. Now, this is the percentage. So although we've been involved in more crashes, our actual percentage of crashes that were preventable has actually gone down. At one point in 2013, we were as high as around 70-80%, but in 2016, 46% of our crashes were deemed preventable by the Fleet Accident Review Board. I do want to note that after 2013, and Lieutenant Sanchez can answer this a little bit more thoroughly, there was a policy change in how officers responded to calls, which could be a factor into why we saw a decrease in the percentage of preventable calls.
I want to ask a question.
Yes, ma'am.
The preventable crashes are determined, what are the criteria for determining whether or not it's preventable?
To sum up APD policy, and if I need to go further, I can have Lieutenant Sanchez come up here, is that any crash, any minor damage, the standard here in Albuquerque is very low. So if an officer backs up and lightly hits another car and there's minimal damage, they still have to report it. In other jurisdictions, they would not report that. But any crash, any type of collision in which there was a factor that the officer wasn't following policy or whatnot would be deemed preventable.
Okay.
Okay. APD sworn officer count, real quickly, there's where we're at. That 844 number is as of June 22nd, 2017. I tried to take a number right at the end of the 6-month reporting period for 2017. These are APD-involved crashes. One of the things you asked of us is that we wanted to know the seriousness of the crashes. These are crashes, this is just a strict number, these are the number of crashes in which risk management has deemed that they might have to pay some sort of medical expenses on the crashes, into which there might be some sort of liability at stake. This is not necessarily the number of crashes involving injuries. And as I will address, I don't have that data. And that's an issue that we're going to address. And thanks to Lieutenant Sanchez, we already have at APD. This is the duty status of the APD employee. Duty status wasn't start being kept by these records until mid-2015. I went through, or excuse me, our team went through all the crashes, and we found that for 2016, 207 of them were on duty, 16 were off duty. I had 26 crashes that said unknown, 55 that said blank. On-duty preventable was 104, and we found off-duty preventable 5. I wanted to include those 26 and 55 in here so you know that there are crashes in which we do not have a duty status listed on them.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
This refers to, in a previous slide, you talked about not having, there were things that weren't filled out in the report.
That's not, I'm sorry.
And this also is unknown and blank. So is that something that you can address, that the department plans to address? Because that could be a cover-up or could just be sloppy.
Absolutely, and it's already being addressed. And I was going to say this at the end.
Okay.
First off, I really want to thank all of you for this, because there's a lot of things that we learned at the department due to this process. And we need to get better with how we store the data and our availability to be able to analyze it. And Lieutenant Sanchez had a meeting on Tuesday with numerous different divisions to address this issue already, so that we can have an analyst look at this data real time and so that we can spot these errors. But it wasn't a matter of, for the injuries, them not filling out the proper form. We quite frankly don't have a method of having a form electronically to check the box that says there were injuries. We just don't. We would have to pull each and every single individual crash report in order to figure out what that is.
On the blanks piece, where missing information is missing, as it relates to officer-involved accidents, it would be interesting to know if a sample data of regular accidents not involving police officers had a similar problem, and you'd be able to compare those two.
Right.
See what I'm saying? Future, just a future thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. APD employees involved in multiple crashes. So what we did was, in blue, you can see that represents how many, the number of preventable crashes they were in that 4-year period, or excuse me, 3.5-year or 4.5-year period. So we had 63 officers in 4.5 years were in 2 preventable crashes, 15 were in 3 preventable crashes, and 2 were in 4 preventable crashes from 2013 to 2017. Okay, so that's for 4.5 years. Now, just taking a single year, Okay, during that period, we had 24 officers who were involved in 2 preventable crashes in a single year, and we had 5 officers who were involved in 3 preventable crashes in a single year during that period as well. One of the things I do want to make sure that we note is that if you're in the 15 column, you're not in the 63 column. So it's not cumulative.
Okay, and at some point, somebody will address for us what will happen in this. I mean, because we're trying to make those who are having difficulty with accidents solve that problem with the training or whatever. So somebody will report that. This is just the data right now.
Absolutely. At this point, this is the data and the policies that's recommended from the board, and where operations review goes is going to be using the data to make those decisions.
Cool. Thank you.
I also included, and this wasn't requested, but I just get curious and I love data. So we included a pin map of every single APD employee crash in the city of Albuquerque. You can see the dots on the map. So dots are a little bit hard to read. So something that we do in crime analysis, we do heat maps of where crime occurs. Well, instead of where crime occurs, we did a heat map of APD involved crashes. This shows us that we are seeing a large density of crashes that are occurring in the Valley Area Command as well as in the Southeast Area Command. If I were to take our crime maps and overlay this, it would pretty much mirror what we're seeing in terms of crime. So crashes are occurring, it appears, at this point, where crimes occur.
And is there a pursuit? Well, that's a priority 1, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be connected to the priority 1 data.
Correct.
Okay.
This is I included this. There was nothing really outstanding here about this data, but we did go through by hand, and for each of these crashes, and we're dealing with over 1,000 crashes, we actually wrote down the year each employee was hired. And you can see there that there's the average years of experience for the employees. I included what our overall average was as of that July 27th date. So we're looking at about the average experience, not age, of officers is between 7 to 8 years that are involved in collisions. Now this is key, types of crashes, because the logical question is going to be, well, what type of crashes we're dealing with? And I've actually done some more research looking at other studies in other jurisdictions, and the trend that I've noticed is that almost every agency is reporting, looking at previous studies that have been done over decades, that one of the #1 causes of the types of crashes is backing up. And as you can see, 23% of all of our crashes during this study period was due to officers backing up. And we actually saw, if you look at 2016 compared to 2015, a sharp increase in backing up collisions. The majority of backing up collisions are preventable. These are all crashes in the city limits of Albuquerque, and this would go to environmental factors. So, I'm sorry, did you have a question, Doctor?
Yes, sir. In regard to the types of crashes, it might be interesting to fold this data against the data from insurance companies in terms of whether or not there's something unique about officer-involved crashes as compared with those by just the general population.
Well, that's a good question, and we thought about that. Here's the problem, okay? If you back up into a pole in your driveway, are you going to report that to your insurance company or file a police report?
Probably not.
We do. We report it. And so that's the problem that lies, is that the standard is completely different. So we thought about doing that. We thought about looking at miles driven by the average public in terms of crashes. We just can't do it because we have 2 different standards that play in the data.
Okay, fair enough.
Here's all crashes in the city limits. Now, I've got the 2017 projection going down. We haven't gone through our winter months yet, so I fully expect that number to go up. These are miles driven by police vehicles. So you probably are asking, wait a second, we've got fewer officers since 2012. Why are we seeing an increase in miles? We have noticed, without doing any type of calculation, because we don't have 10 years worth of data for me to be able to put an R value to any of this, okay, is that with our sworn count going down, our miles driven is actually increasing. And the reason why is because the priority 1 calls are also increasing. So this is telling us that officers are driving further to get to their calls for service. Now, if priority one calls and the number of officers decreased, you would probably see things plateau in terms of miles are driven. But the fact that we have fewer miles being driven, or fewer officers, is indicating that there's an increase in the miles driven by our officers, which also increases the probability of them being involved in a crash.
Now, if you had more officers, would they be distributed? So let's say a precinct within, I don't know if that's the word you use here.
Area command?
Well, but the subsets within the area
beat or
command.
the sectors. Yeah, and we've got, so within an area command, we'll have sectors, and then within the sectors, we'll have beats.
So if you had more officers, you would have more per sector, correct?
Correct.
Right.
And-
So
and I'm
that
not-
way, that means that when somebody needs backup, they come from perhaps a different sector.
Absolutely. So if your call volume does not increase and your officer count decreases, beat integrity starts to loosen up because we have multiple officers going into different beats. Now, I will say this. If you go back and look at the data, the number of officers assigned to Field Services Bureau in terms of the ones that bid it have pretty much stayed plateau, even though our overall count of officers has decreased because we've reallocated how we deploy the resources. But the problem is the priority one calls continue to increase based on looking at this data.
And that's curious too. Drilling down on the why priority one calls going up is interesting.
Which is a whole nother study.
Yeah.
Property damage paid. This is property damage paid, includes all damage to vehicles and property paid by risk management. I do need to have a disclaimer. These numbers could very well fluctuate. Sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years for claims to get paid. But I just want to present the data so you have it as of this date. This is the property damage that's been paid. Okay, this is priority one calls for service. Don't expect this to change too much. This is what we're looking at. We had about 65,000 priority one calls for service in 2013, and now we're projecting that they're dealing with as many as 74,000 priority one calls for service in 2017. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Having done a fair number of ride-alongs, I'm beginning to understand the priority system, and I don't know if there's any way of changing it, but it seems to me that a lot of priority one calls aren't really priority one. That is to say, if a robbery has occurred 6 hours ago and it's discovered, is that a priority one? It seems as though they're classified that way, and you got to run quickly to it, but
So the
why?
basic definition of priority one calls is any immediate threat to any life or property that might exist, so offender present. Now, that has fluctuated over years due to administrations and due to what's being considered a priority. I do know that the department has been looking into, and I don't have the specifics of the priority system and whether or not we should stay at a 3-tier or 5-tier priority system. So that's something that's constantly being examined by our communications director, Erica Wilson. Property damage paid per APD involved crash. I put this graph in here because it's requested, well, how serious are these crashes? Well, how do you measure how serious a crash is? Do you do it by injury? Well, the best value that we could put together is, well, because injuries are negotiable, and whenever there's bodily injury, as it's been explained to us by risk management, it could vary based on the negotiations with the attorneys and insurance companies. So we tried to just do it to property damage paid, because that's it's not as negotiable as what injury or bodily injury or claims or medical or bodily injury claims could be. So per crash, this is what we're averaging, in terms of each crash and what the property damage was paid on all APD involved crashes. And again, those numbers could change as claims get settled. Yes, sir.
How does this reflect the total cost of a crash?
How does this reflect the total cost of a crash?
Right. The property damage is what fraction of the total cost, in your opinion?
It varies. I'm probably not the best person to talk about that because I'm not a risk management expert. But we could run the calculations. If you look at the very first slide in terms of if you take the medical liability and the property damage liability and take a look at what that cost would be, it could very well fluctuate. Now, the thing I want to point out is that one crash will be an outlier in the data. And what do I mean by that? Obviously we've had some tragedies in our community where, the city has paid a very high amount in terms of medical liability and bodily injury paid. One crash that could cost the city $8 million would definitely throw off that statistic for you. So I was avoiding doing that because I didn't want to give you bad data.
So this is a per crash estimate?
Per crash, property damage only, because
Okay,
medical
so in
is so.
2013, the average of that year was $900, a little over $900.
$900 of property damage paid, not medical.
That was the average for all of the property damage on a per incident basis?
Per crash, yes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So, and how many crashes does this reflect, this number?
Yeah, good question.
This number, in 2016, we had 304 crashes. Okay, so we looked at 3 possible factors here. We talked about priority 1 calls, we talked about all collisions in the city of Albuquerque, and we talked about miles driven. So what I'm going to do is show you how that relates per crash. So this is APD involved crashes, and these are priority 1 calls. This is APD involved crashes compared to all crashes in the city of Albuquerque. This is APD involved crashes compared to miles driven. Now, these are the factors to consider. So, our baseline is we know that APD involved crashes are increasing. That's a fact. What could be some factors? Well, here are the possible factors. Priority 1 calls, miles driven, all crashes in the city of Albuquerque. You can see how they trend and make your own conclusion. For us to draw a correlation, I would not feel comfortable with 4.5 years of solid data. I would feel a lot more comfortable with 10. But for me to be able to sit here and say, we're involved in more crashes because of priority 1 calls, because of miles driven, or because more people are crashing in Albuquerque, I can't say that. I think it's best that the board looks at the data and draw its own conclusion. And everyone can look at the data and draw their own conclusion as well.
And what did you say was the percentage increase in crashes? That was back somewhere.
For crashes,
Yeah, that the percentage of crashes had gone up in 2016.
it was a little I think it was 40, and I could look at the other slide. I believe it was over 40% for all crashes, and preventable crashes went up a little over 30%.
Is it in there?
Yes, sir.
I may be a little bit slow, but I'm back on the property damage paid per crash, and I see it going down from $900 per incident to about $400 per incident.
Yes, sir.
And I'm aware that if I ding my side mirror, that's $1,000. And I don't understand how you can get off with only $400 per collision. I mean, that would have to be a fly speck on your bumper.
But
at today's prices.
But the thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to be the one that your insurance company deems at fault, the city risk management's not paying for that. It's your insurance company paying for that mirror, not ours. So if you're involved in a crash with an APD vehicle, okay, and your insurance company is paying for the damage of your car because they deem, not our risk management, that you're at fault, then we're not paying that property damage to your vehicle.
So this is the only when APD is deemed to be, by the insurance company, to be at fault?
Or by risk management, and I'd have to refer you to risk management to explain that data even further.
Okay.
Okay, because I do not want to speak out of school for risk management because we've gone around and around on how to calculate this.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so other cities, as a part of the analysis, we sent out several emails to police listservs, including all chiefs of police, police researchers, and police managers. Agencies were asked these questions, and you can see those questions there. Number of crashes, number of those crashes that were deemed by your agency preventable, number of crashes that involved any type of injury, number of those collisions that occurred off duty. Does your agency have take-home cars for every officer? The number of marked vehicle currently in your fleet. So Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, Oklahoma City, Tucson, Newport News, and El Paso responded. Miami-Dade kind of responded, and all they said was they gave me like 2,000 crashes, and that was it. So I did not include them in this report. Now, here's the issue. Now, Albuquerque ranked lowest in terms of the percentage of crashes with in which the agency determined was preventable. However, it ranked high in the number of crashes when compared to the size of jurisdiction and the number of officers. It is difficult to look at this data from the other agencies and draw conclusions as to whether Albuquerque has a high crash rate, and this is why. In Louisville, they don't consider that little fender bender example I gave you as an example of would be a crash that would be reportable. They just don't. None of these other cities, just about all of them with the exception of Tucson, and I'll talk about Tucson here in a bit, they're in the same issue that we're in. They don't have the data. They can't tell me number of crashes involving injuries. They can't tell me whether or not their officers were on and off duty, and I'm going to show you that in a chart. There's no consistent standard method amongst these agencies in how they determine whether crashes are preventable, and some agencies have various versions of the take-home car policy. So would you consider Louisville with a take-home car policy if it doesn't give a take-home car to officers that have less than 5 years experience? How do you equate that to the situation that we're in? And they also change in what they consider a marked car. We consider anything that has the word police or emergency equipment on it as a marked vehicle. Louisville does not, because one thing they don't have, like we do, is a robust PSA2 and PSA1 program. So there are so many different variables to be able to do a comparative analysis with the cities. Now that said, I simply put the data in this chart. Here's the data. This is what it is. Now when you see NA, they simply don't report that. So Columbus, Newport News, off-duty crashes, or how many crashes were off-duty, they don't keep track of that data. And then in some cases where you see a DNA, that means they did not answer. I
want to recap because I want to make sure that we all get this. So whether or not an accident is reported, a type of accident is reportable for a police officer in other cities differs from our definition. They differ from each other.
Absolutely.
As well. And then if it is reported, which could be a lower threshold for us, if they do report it, how they report it, whether or not it's preventable is another question.
Correct.
Okay, so it really is apples to oranges.
It is. And through all the research that I've done, there is not a standard across the country. Now, there's been a lot of studies done by the Sheriff's Association, NIJ. They have done studies over decades. And when they've done those studies, they had to take each individual report and look at them individually. They couldn't just take a sum of data and do their analysis. They spent a lot of money trying to make those, the conclusions that they made in their studies.
You and I visited about this earlier. I really do think the International Association for Chiefs of Police could be taking a look at this, because I think it is a cost factor in their budgets, and I think to the extent that that's useful and can prevent accidents, that would be a good thing for there to be some kind of universal
Absolutely.
data system.
And there's been a lot of studies that have been commissioned, sponsored by IACP, that I've been able to find over the years.
Yeah.
And what we are seeing is traffic collisions is the #1 killer of police officers, with the exception of gunfire in the nation. And it's
A
increased.
point brought up by Dr. Ring at one of our previous meetings was we keep really good track of officer-involved shootings, but we don't keep track of accidents that can also lead to death, which was, I think, a direct quote from you, sir.
Yes.
So I think it really is important, especially as we see those numbers go up.
And thus far nationwide, I checked yesterday, we were at 6% increase in number of officers killed in traffic collisions this year compared to last year. So not all is lost with looking at the other agencies. One agency in particular that I was quite impressed with, and I'm going to put a question mark best practice, was Tucson. They track absolutely everything. They can tell you the age group, and if you see in this frequency distribution table, they could track the age group of their officers and tell you, okay, what age of officers is getting in more crashes. That time of day frequency, they can tell you that on Wednesdays and Thursdays between 1200 and 1800 is when we're seeing a high amount of crashes. They can tell you the ranks. These are questions we can't answer right now. They can also tell you if the injury to another party, if there are previous crashes involving injuries. All these are questions we can't answer. They can also tell you if the officer was wearing a seatbelt. They can tell you if the officer was en route to a call. All these are very important in trying to identify what could be some type of causes and whether or not changes need to be made either to equipment, because we have seen a lot of that there have been equipment failures that have caused crashes over the years by studies done across the nation, or if there needs to be a change in policy or training. And the more data that's collected, the better decisions that obviously can be made in reference to that. So moving on to the observations. 2016, yes, had the highest number of preventable crashes and the fewest number of officers. Thus far, property damage paid by risk management has continued to decrease in 2016. However, if risk management was here, they easily will tell you that very well could change. Okay? 2013, statistically of this period, was the worst of the study period. It ranked the highest in miles driven per preventable crash, property damage paid per crash, total medical paid per crash, the number of crashes involving injuries, priority 1 calls per preventable crash, and it also had the highest percentage of crashes that were preventable. The data suggests that officers are traveling further to respond to calls for service. More analysis needs to be done to pinpoint exactly which calls were responding, or which cars were responding to which calls. Because remember earlier, I cannot take my mileage and get rid of any of those civilian or detective vehicles.
PSA.
PSA, for example. I would really want to be able to do that, and that's one of the reasons why I don't want to say there's a direct correlation to priority 1 call. I just can't. Preliminary data for 2017 suggests the city will see a decrease in all crashes involving citizens. However, no change in APD-related crashes and an increase in priority 1 calls for service and miles driven will continue to increase in 2017. The majority of crashes are occurring in areas where there's a lot of crime/calls for service. There's no significant change from year to year on the experience level of officers, and every year the number 1 cause of collisions have been backing up. Backing up collisions increased 69% in 2016. Recommendations. I'm going to make these recommendations to my chain of command. After doing this study, like I said, I learned a lot, and I've been working with Lieutenant Sanchez quite a lot. I've also been working with Peter Innan and Brett Farglass over at Risk Management, and all of them have been very helpful, and we all, I think, are actually going to be working to make some changes. But certainly the department could adopt a better record-keeping system to track the following data: the age of officer, general cause of collision, whether injuries were involved, if the vehicle's marked, if the officer was en route to the call, road conditions. This data is collected but not entered into electronic database such as SharePoint. Operations Review already had a meeting on this Tuesday. They've actually had 2 or 3 meetings to try to make this happen. Once we have a data collection system in place, data, in my opinion, should be analyzed on a quarterly basis to see if any trends exist. Operations is already addressing some issues that they discovered due to this study and are taking certain training actions because of that. If you have any questions of that, I would have to refer you over to Lieutenant Sanchez. It's impossible with this time period and data provided to draw direct correlations to any one factor. The limited data provided suggests correlations can be drawn between miles driven, calls for service, and number of officers. However, we would need a larger sample. A more comprehensive study in which each individual report is examined could be beneficial to decision making, and the police department could certainly continue to work with the Citizen Police Oversight Agency analyst or whoever you deem appropriate to accomplish this. And my shop is more than willing to work with whatever analyst that you hire or appoint or contract with to make sure that they have the adequate knowledge and the ability to gather the data as well.
I thank you, TJ. I would like to hear from Lieutenant Sanchez, particularly because I know you've been implementing some things as officers who've had repeat accidents, and I know you've been working on that.
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. TJ, we need to answer the questions people have.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for stopping me.
I was wondering if it would be useful to you, I know, to visit Tucson and look at their system. I'm interested in their algorithms of how they, collected their data, because that data is very, very interesting to me. And I'm with you. I don't know if it's state of the art or best practice or whatever, but it'd be really interesting to know.
Absolutely. They did send me a downloadable file of all their data so I could take a look at it. It looks very basic in terms of their collection method, but there's nothing wrong with basic. If you're collecting the data and it's easily accessible, you can do a thorough analysis. So I would agree, Dr. Garcia, we'd love to be able to go to Tucson and ask some more questions, specifically in what they're doing with this data. They told me that they haven't really noticed too many trends here lately, but certainly they're able to know that because they have all the data. Yes, sir.
Dr. Cass?
You didn't, I don't find, I feel kind of out of sorts here, but I don't find any reference to medical costs, and you mentioned in here that.
If you look at page, I believe it's the one that says raw data.
Oh, okay.
I did not take out medical costs because they are such a fluctuating number, but I did provide the raw data to you.
Oh, okay, fine.
Okay? So if you look at total medical, that's paid as of to date.
Oh, okay.
So you see that 2013 number that I was talking about, how we have an outlier? That 2013 would give us a huge outlier. When I'm dealing with a 5-year data set, it's going to skew absolutely everything.
Right. No, I understand, and I just wanted to know if there was a reference to it. I didn't see it in there. But I have a couple of other questions, and that is, I'm a physical scientist, so usually at the conclusion of these kind of talks, you say, well, we need more data, you know, and this.
And that's what I said.
and you said that was your obligation to say that, and so this is a friendly question. I mean, given what you've seen so far, what flags do you see? And then I've got another one, and that is my naivete about trend analysis for these kinds of data. What would be a flag? What would be a trend analysis that would raise a flag or raise a question that would result in a policy change? So which one of these trend analyses that you show here might be something that would, if it were stronger than it's shown, but which one of these sets of data would indicate the necessity that you might have an actual policy change?
We certainly have not identified one that, certainly if we were able to, and we could probably, with you being a physical scientist, we could probably talk about data till we turn blue. That's how much I love data. Certainly, if we had more actual years to be able to calculate an R-score, for example, we could certainly say, okay, do we need to address policy, in terms of how we respond to certain calls. But the other issue is resource allocation as well. If we know that we're traveling further miles, certainly the data could be used to look at certain decisions that are made in terms of resource allocation, which could definitely be a factor. So I don't think it's a hard stretch for me to say the more miles we drive, the more crashes we're going into. If we could somehow affect that miles that we're driving to all these calls, certainly that could very well have an effect. And that would be somewhere I would definitely start. If I had to make a recommendation, now I'm not a politician or a professor, and I try to stay away from that, drawing conclusions, but that's something I would continue to look at as an analyst.
Oh, there you are. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I did. I have one question. In regards to, you indicated that the Valley of Northeast Command, on the pin chart, their crashes are occurring in the crime area? Oh, southeast?
Yes, sir. It's the southeast and the valley had the highest concentration when we did a hotspot density map. We do have a small area right there at Manal and Carlisle, I believe. But if you go down, our highest density and levels of concentration, we had a little spot up there in the North Valley Area Command. We have a lot downtown.
And my question is, are you addressing that at all, now that you know this information?
We're certainly making this data available. I don't know if the density of calls are happening there, the density of crashes are happening there. I'm not quite sure what can be addressed at this point, other than that we have this information and we're making it available. Further research would have to be done to see if there's any, and I think where you're getting at is environmental factors, such as, am I right, such as traffic, or is that what you mean?
Right.
Okay. Certainly we're going to make this data available to traffic management, but I would also want to see an overlay of all those crashes in the city of Albuquerque to see if they correlate to where there could indicate whether or not there are any environmental factors. Because it's certainly, we don't want to come to a false conclusion and say that there's an environmental factor when that could just simply be where we get a lot of calls for service. we would have to take what our environmental data set would be, and that would be all crashes, do an overlay and make that determination. But that's certainly something we could continue to do and work with Department of Municipal Development to do that.
Okay, thank you.
I have only a comment, and I really thank you for the, jumping in and doing the work that you did. I just would caution everyone, and just because I'm the worry ward here, but just don't extrapolate beyond in this case, it's data, but it's demographics. So you can't extrapolate it you just don't extrapolate beyond the data at this point. We're not there yet. And I do appreciate that you've done that much work. But I just don't want people to draw conclusions that are not founded in some kind of framework.
Absolutely. And, the analysis or the example we like to say is, well, it's easy to look at something and say that's a factor. It would just be the same as saying, ice cream sales go up in Chicago and murders go up in Chicago. So obviously they have to be related. Well, there's another factor to that, and that's the heat, which obviously causes ice cream sales to go up and homicides to go up. So just to use that very simple elementary example, it's important that you're right, we don't do that, and we take into account what all possible factors could be.
Any other questions? I'd like to hear from Lieutenant Sanchez about what you've learned about those who have had multiple accidents in a short period of time.
First of all, good afternoon. I really appreciate the help that we've actually received from you and the support that we've received from you when we've been addressing some of these issues, and especially getting this data together. We really do appreciate that opportunity. Now, there's a couple of things that I know there was a couple of questions that I would like to go back to with regards to some of these hotspots, especially in the Valley Area Command. And like TJ said, it is hard to pinpoint why they're happening, but there could be the Valley Area Command, for example. A lot of our officers from all other area commands drive downtown, and there's several reasons for that. You have the main police department, you have the prisoner transport unit. A lot of that personnel at one time or another may make it into the Valley Area Command. So it would be hard to try to pinpoint that. With regards to what we're doing and what we have, what we took out of this data, we in fact have made certain steps because of this data. We have taken certain steps. For example, we did send out a special order not too long ago with the way that we were going to be reporting our traffic accidents. There was a lot of confusion as to how we were documenting those accidents. And in order to be able to retrieve and obtain and keep better data, we changed the way that that reporting system went. So what it would do, it would prevent us from missing certain reports. Back in the times where we had hard copies, everything didn't always make it to where it was supposed to go. But now that it's electronic, it makes it easier for us to track it. And it has allowed us to see some of those situations and where officers have had several accidents. We have addressed those, and I'll give you the same example that I gave you before. We had an officer that had a couple of accidents, several accidents within a short period of time. Well, my detectives were able to see that. They came back to me because of the way that we had started recording some of this and said, sir, this is what we've seen, and what are we going to do? So we sent that back to the chain of command and determined that this officer needed to go through some driver training. So he was sent through our what we call an EVOC class. It's Emergency Vehicle Operations course. And so that officer was sent to that. So we have taken some of these steps. We're still working on the process and on how we're going to implement it into our procedures, because we have to ensure that we abide by the contract too. Because now we have to determine, look, we have situations where is it going to be a discipline issue or is it going to be a training issue? And so we have to be very careful. So we are working towards that. And what we would like to accomplish eventually is say, okay, we need to make sure that we reduce every accident with, especially if there's officers that are having multiple accidents, and that we are going ahead and making sure that we're preventing that.
When Commander McCrae was here, he talked about, we asked him this question about the training, and what he said to us was, there's a computer training, and I know you're talking about driving training, that's real driving training, and so I just want to make that distinction that there's multiple different things you have available to increase the training and make it situation appropriate.
Right, and it is. The defensive driving training, there is one course that the officers, in order to renew their the city operator's permit, they have to go through the defensive driving course, which is on a computer. There are certain situations where that may be an option. For more serious situations, should I say, as far as this incidents where officers are having multiple accidents, we're still working on determining what is going to be that threshold, what is going to be that level that we say, if this officer has 2 accidents in a 1-year period, do we have him retake the defensive driving course online, or do we say, no, I think it's better if we send him out to the driving track with an instructor, or is it 3? So we have to take those into account. Do we take into account the seriousness of the accident? So those are things that we're still working on, but we are working on trying to get to that point where we'll be able to address any training issues and any issues that any patterns that we're seeing.
I have a comment. I'd like to commend you on your willingness to work with us, and also that your commitment to transparency and keeping it real for everyone. So I want to thank you very much for that.
Thank you, ma'am.
It is clear to me from having been through this process, and actually the 3 of us, and Dr. Brown also was involved in the focus questions, the initial questions. So I'm grateful that we were included from the very ground of this, and that it actually came from us through Deputy Chief Garcia, and actually ended up with a report that has some teeth to it and some real meat in there. Could there be more? Absolutely. You know, will there be more? Probably. It's clear to me that what was clear to me in this process was that risk management, the operations, which Lieutenant Sanchez runs, and TJ's Real-Time Crime Center with his professional staff really came together and everything was on the table. Everything that we asked was on the table, and I really appreciate that, and I believe them when they say they did not do this before and they see the value in doing it now. So I commend you for your work, I commend you for your willingness to do the work, and I look forward to hearing updates. Please come back to us and tell us what else you've discovered or other changes you've made as a result of this, or other things that you'd want us to know. So thank you.
Thank
We're grateful to you.
and we appreciate it. And we are moving on that data, on that collection. IT, Leslie in IT has actually been great, and she's starting to look at putting something together to where we're all going to be able to send our different data into that centralized location to make it easier to track and include some of that missing data. So we are, and again, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I just want to make sure that is that where the extra copies are, right behind you?
Yes,
Right here? So media people, if you want copies of that report, you're welcome to it.
I did also want to say one thing. I do really want to thank the board. This is the first time I've worked with the Police Oversight Board. It was a pleasure. I look forward to continue to working with you guys if any other issues come up. It was a good change of pace for us because usually we look at crime data at the Real-Time Crime Center. So it was kind of fun to actually look at some different data. So I really want to thank you, and you guys were great through the process, and we look forward to continuing to serve you again in the future.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you for all your work, and Lieutenant Sanchez, I guess, is behind you there. It's really a pleasure, because I think we got even more data than we asked for. And I think, along with what Chairperson Fine said, that it would be wonderful to have follow-up on this, especially, I'm especially interested in what you were saying at the end, Lieutenant Sanchez, about whether things are disciplinary issues or whether they're training issues. I'd love to hear more about that when you come back. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it.